Hey guys, welcome to Office Hours with Bob Ross, episode number 34. All right, I hope that all of you are doing well out there. It has been a minute since the last podcast episode, and that particular episode had to do with 5 influential books, in my perspective, books that I have found useful in my practice, books that I feel could help out possibly with your study of improvisation and or harmony, guitar, etc., any other instrument that you may be playing. And today what I want to do is continue on and introduce a few more books. And here's what I'm going to do. I have a few more than 5 left, but what I'll do is just mention the other books in a little bit more sparse way. Just additional books that you may want to check out. But I'm going to start with a book. It's actually going to be 2 books. The first, and both are by the same author, Hal Crook. The first book that I'm going to discuss here is Ready, Aim, Improvise, and subtitle Exploring the Basics of Jazz Improvisation. And this book is for all instruments. It is a very detailed book. There is the book that I mentioned last week by Mark Levine. This book goes into a little bit more detail than the previous, than the Mark Levine book, in my opinion. I mean, the other one, the Mark Levine one is excellent because it has a lot of musical examples in it coming from recordings, actual references to recordings. It gives you specifics that it can identify in a real-world setting. This book is a bit more detailed in that the theory aspect of it, they go into, my opinion, is more detail. And there are some sections I've had to go back through and try to read through to get a better understanding of, just because I feel like it's one of those books that if you're really into it, you really nerd out on the theory aspect of it in the first about half of this book, then you may want to check into this. And I'm going to go through and just mention a few of the things. And this one does come with a couple CDs where you can listen along. But the book is divided off into different parts. So you have part 1, which is preparation, and it goes into theory. And then there's a whole subset of materials there. Harmony, ear training, repertoire, and embellishment. And like I said, with these parts, these smaller sections, it divides off in even more specific details into the theory/harmony of this, and it gets pretty detailed. There's if you're really looking at analyzing everything in great detail, I think that this book would allow for that, for you to be able to pick up on that and do that. Part 2 of the book is Jazz Vocabulary, and it's divided off into execution, how to play, and content, what to play. And the great thing with as you're getting into these type of things with the jazz vocabulary, and then in the next section, the part 3, which is target practice, and that includes chord tone soloing and chord scale soloing. Restriction means expansion inside the outside chords and musical impact. The great thing is that this book will set up these parameters in your practice. Now, some of you follow what I do, you know that I'll mention things like limited creativity. That's basically what you're getting here. You're getting these parts that are discussing ways to limit what you're doing in your improvisation. That way you can focus on specific things. And one of the things I remember reading that I felt was had a pretty big influence when I was first reading through. And you'd think back and it's like, well, that's common sense in some respects. And it just takes someone else saying it, is that if you're going to focus on something such as your rhythm, then a suggestion is to make the harmony less complex. Simplify the harmony. That way your rhythm component can really be focused on and working out whether you want to do odd meter, polyrhythms, maybe a certain way of playing where you're using whole notes, half notes, quarter notes, etc., eighth note lines, triplets, any of that. But then when you want to work on more complex harmonic material, then your rhythmic aspect can be simplified so you can focus on the details of what you're trying to do with the harmony. That's something that I found very useful coming from this book, especially that targeted section where you're, and he does give examples. He has written out examples of how to do this. But this book is fairly detailed, and if you're one of those kind of people who really like to indulge in a lot of text and really getting into the subject, then I suggest that maybe you take a look at this. And this book is over 300 pages. So, it's definitely one to pick up just to have as a reference tool. Now, there's another one by Hal Crook, kind of similar. It's called How to Improvise, An Approach to Practicing Improvisation. And this book, to me, is taking some of the material that you would find in the other book, dealing with target practice, and focusing a little bit more on that. So let me give you a basic outline of what's happening with this. You have section 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. So there's 5 sections to this. In the first section, I'll throw out a couple things that are in there. It's talking about the pacing, phrase length, rhythmic density, guide tone lines, using chord scales. In section 2, he starts to go into stretching the time, using scale patterns, dynamics, motives in your soloing, or motifs, depending on how you want to pronounce that. Everybody's got their way of saying, I think that sometimes motif. Section 3 refers to or mentions rhythmic displacement, using upper structure triads, pentatonic scales, syncopation, the register of your instrument. Section 4 talks about over-the-bar line phrasing, using double time, half time, solo links, peak points. Section 5 will go into triad couplings, non-harmonic major scales, chromatic scale, tritonic scales, and tetratonic scales. So with this book, it's less of the theory aspect and going into that, like the other book, Ready, Aim, Improvise. It discusses that a little bit less and gets right into things that you can do as far as application of ideas into your improvisational practice. Now, the next book is a book by David Baker. And this book is Practicing Jazz, A Creative Approach, subtitled New and Exciting Strategies for Unlocking Your Creative Potential. Now, this book, I'd gotten this book before the Hal Crook books, and just as many of you out there may encounter, there are some things in general that you start to notice that there's some overlapping. I mean, even in the instructional material that you see out there from a variety of players, musicians, maybe even you, myself included, is that we pick up on all these things and then we have our take on it and we put it back out there, and it just keeps going through a cycle And this book, I think, definitely shares some things that I mentioned from last podcast with David Berkman's book on practice, as well as the Hal Crook books. It's talking about basically those kind of parameters or those limitations that you put on your practice in order to gain a specific concept or to acquire that ability into your playing. Now, this book is divided off into general suggestions for constructive practice, and that's the first section here, or chapter 1. And a couple of things that it talks about is the things that you should include in your practice, like listening, sight reading, ear training, etc. It's talking about not only playing your ideas, but singing them. It also talks about a list of things that I just think are great to keep in mind, as far as like learn all music by rote whenever possible. Never allow yourself the luxury of complacency or self-satisfaction. I mean, there's a lot of suggestions here to start off the book, and then it goes off into chapter 2, imaginative scale practicing. Then it talks about imposing constraints on your practice with melodic, harmonic, or dynamic constraints, rhythmic constraints. It talks about practice formulas, tune learning strategy, transcribing. I mean, there's a lot of valuable things in here. It's not as big of a book as the Hal Crook books, but there is so much in it, very similar to the Jerry Coker book that I mentioned before, where there's just a lot of stuff in a very, I don't want to say that it's a very short book. I mean, it's what, like 60 pages, but there's so much material. It's almost like the Advancing Guitarist book. It's like you can take one concept and work on it for long, extended periods of time. The next one that I want to mention is one by Dan Haerle, and it's a book called The Jazz Language, a theory text for jazz composition and improvisation. Now, this is a book, just like the title suggests, this is a book on theory. This doesn't go through, the application, if you will, on how to, practice in this way or do this. This goes through the theoretical side of it. And it's divided off into 14 chapters, and then it has this appendix section, 5 different ones. But the basic overall idea of this book, like what you would find in this book, it goes into intervals, chord construction, modes of the major scale, talks about substitutions, polychords, modes of melodic minor, talks about synthetic scales, pentatonics, developing improvisational skills. That's one little section where it talks about, perhaps a little bit of the application. And also it deals with the like 5-part harmony, etc. So this book has a lot of information, and it's set up in such a way where it has study questions, and it gives you exercises where you write things out, play it on a keyboard, do some ear training. So this is another one that if you're really looking at a theory type book, I would suggest picking up this book. That way you can quiz yourself on it, get to know things a little bit better. It's not a very long book. Again, not as intense as the Hal Crook book, but it definitely has a lot of great information in it. Now, there's one other book in the set of 5 that I'm going to mention, and then I'm just going to make mention of 2 others that you may want to check out. Book number 5 is Jazz Composer's Companion by Gil Goldstein. I picked this book up when I was a grad student at UArts, and it was a required text, and this book has a lot of suggestions on composing, like some ideas that you can use to develop compositions, and it's divided off into some different sections, And the great thing is also the ideas that it suggests that you use are shown in compositions by musicians that you may recognize. Like there's one here that's a tune called "Distant Hills" by Ralph Towner, and it goes into like certain points that it's not trying, but points that the author is making. He's demonstrating through the compositions, and this book, just to give you an idea of what you'll find in here. Section 1 or part 1 goes into melody, and it talks about the pitch axis, melodic exercises, intervals, composing with intervals. It gives a list of different, it shows some compositions where these things are being used so you can see it. 12 interval technique, 12 interval melody exercises, pentatonic scales. You can also go to the next section and find where harmony is being brought in. So you're thinking more about the harmony as opposed to the melody, and you're creating chords with intervals. Harmonic exercises are being used. He gives, again, examples by Bill Evans, Kenny Wheeler, Ralph Towner, chord extension exercises, voicing, the slash chords, inversions, voice leading in general. In the rhythm section, he goes into rhythmic values, composing with those rhythmic values, changing time signatures, counter rhythms. It goes into tone color exercises, and then compositional processes, which is the 5th section. This is a great book. If anything, I mean, flip to the back of the book and check out section 5, where he's talking to these musicians about their compositional process. And musicians include Chick Corea, Pat Metheny, Horace Silver, Steve Swallow, Ralph Towner, Lyle Mays, Herbie Hancock, Bill Evans, Randy Brecker. So this is a book definitely to check out if you're really into the composition and compositional process, and maybe you're finding that you are having some issues with being stuck or feeling like you're stuck. This would give you some ideas to try out and maybe give you some new direction in your composition. There's 2 other books here that I have in front of me that I want to mention. One is by Jerry Coker called Clear Solutions for Jazz Improvisers. This is another great book that has a lot of information in, less than 100 pages. And it talks about, dealing with some things that come up, like one thing that comes up is like improvising over a minor 2-5-1. That gets talked about a lot. I actually put out a video on that and my approach to it. And, turnarounds, elements of the jazz language, chord types and scale types, keeping your place in the changes. I mean, there's some great information in that. And the final one I'm going to say is another one by Dan Haerle called The Jazz Sound. Subtitle is A Guide to Tune Analysis and Chord Scale Choices for Improvisation. Again, this is another book that's less than 100 pages, a lot of information. It goes into understanding the composition, bracketing chord changes, implications of the chord symbols, what the implications of a melody are, the implications of context. Then it goes into, and analyzing compositions. So another one that you may want to check out if you're into studying overall, maybe a little bit, not as heavy on the theory, but, if you're playing tunes and you're trying to understand maybe a little bit more theory behind it or how this works with that may open up some doors for you as well. All right, guys, I want to thank you for listening. I hope that you can take this information, find some of these books that I've mentioned, and, maybe in doing so, it will open up some doors for you and cause you to think maybe a little bit different about the topic of improvisation, jazz, or composition. Think a little differently than you have before. Before you go, don't forget that I do have lessons and courses on my site at musicallessons.com/Bob Ross. Check that out. Also, don't forget to subscribe to the podcast and leave a rating, a comment, share this with others so they can gain some information if you find this enjoyable. And don't forget to join me next time for Office Hours with Bob Ross.